Hi, and welcome to the Unit 5, the Early Republic Intervention lesson. We're going to go back through Unit 5 and try to fill in any gaps or missing information. Let's go ahead and get started. We looked at this image throughout the unit to organize our information for our 5 first presidents. Let's go ahead and start with Washington. If we look back over our packet, and if we're looking at the important ideas page, kind of started from the beginning here, Americans and their leaders faced many challenges after the years, in the years after ratification of the Constitution, when the new republic is established. These early years of the United States. George Washington is going to become the first president in 1789, and he establishes the first cabinet. He also does a lot of other firsts, such as the title of the president, setting a foreign policy, also passing the Judiciary Act, which completed the nation's federal court system. He also put Alexander Hamilton in charge of the National Treasury, and he made him Secretary of the Treasury, and he wanted him to create a stable economic system. To Washington's page here, we looked at Hamilton's economic plan, and we'll talk about that plan more in a moment. The Whiskey Rebellion was also something that Washington had to deal with as president. This was a part of Hamilton's economic plan to put a whiskey tax on the American people to help repay the Revolutionary debt. We have these whiskey rebels in Pennsylvania that rise up to protest the taxes, and it's quickly squashed when Washington and Hamilton ride in with the military, and they all flee and scatter. We also have him choosing his cabinet of advisors, one of those people being Alexander Hamilton in charge of the economy, and then Thomas Jefferson as Secretary of State. And he also gives a farewell address as well as an inaugural address whenever he comes into office and then when he leaves office. In his farewell address, he gives some advice to the American public, and we'll look at that in a moment as well. His proclamation of neutrality is his best known piece of foreign policy, and really this was just his decision to stay out of the conflicts of Britain and France and other European nations, and for the United States to remain neutral. So let's look at Washington and his issues that he had to address here. We know that he had to establish a stable national economy and establish a national court system. So those are big jobs right away. Defining the authority of the central government and also maintaining national security go back to this event with the Whiskey Rebellion. Using executive power to enforce tax laws is how he defines the authority, and then also maintaining national security. We have Hamilton with his economic plan, and these are the basic tenets of his plan. The first, deal with the American Revolution debt. It says here to take on the foreign and domestic debt by replacing creditors' old low-value bonds with new interest-bearing bonds, and also to take over most of the state's $25 million in Revolutionary War debt. He also needs a way to raise revenue, and taxes is usually a way to do that. He passes the whiskey excise tax and also asks for a tariff on imported goods, but he doesn't get that piece. And lastly here, to stabilize the banking system, he wants to create a national bank and also to create a national mint to produce currency for the country. When Washington gives his proclamation of neutrality, he makes a stand on not taking sides with either Britain or France. Jefferson felt like the United States should support France because they had supported the United States during its own revolution. Hamilton and other Federalists wanted to support Great Britain because they felt like that the United States had the strongest ties to Great Britain, and also the trade relationship that was already established. The policy that Washington adopted was the Proclamation of Neutrality, and we can look on the screen here where it says acting as an amateur historian, and it says in his own words that it appears that there's a state of war existing between these European nations. The duty and interest of the United States require that they should adopt a conduct friendly and impartial towards the warring powers. I thought it fit to declare the position of the United States to observe a conduct towards those powers respectfully, and warn our citizens to avoid all acts which may in any manner tend to go against this position. What he's calling for is a proclamation of neutrality, and this is his position on foreign policy. which is going to set a precedent for all other presidents to follow. Washington steps down. He decides to step down after 2 terms. He could have easily been reelected, but he didn't want the presidency to be like a king, and so he decides to leave office. He wrote a letter that we kind of refer to as a speech today, but it's called his farewell address, and he warns of some issues that he saw that concerned him while he was president, the first being the development of political parties. When we see Hamilton and Jefferson start to divide and split away from each other and gather supporters for their particular issues, Washington starts to see the beginnings of possibly political parties rising up. And this really has a lot to do with Jefferson and Madison disagreeing about Hamilton's economic plan. And this gave rise to the first American political parties, the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans. In his farewell address, Washington warned against entangling alliances, believing that the nation should avoid ties to Europe. And so we typically think of this as his neutrality policy. And lastly, he warned against acquiring debt because he spent his entire presidency, along with Hamilton, trying to rid the nation of their Revolutionary War debt. So those are his pieces of advice: no political parties, no alliances, maintain your neutrality, and no national debt. Let's talk about the development of political parties real quick. These 2 political parties developed, like we said, out of the disagreement over Hamilton's economic plan. We have the Federalists on one side with Hamilton and Adams, and we know that John Adams becomes the first Federalist president. On the Democratic Republican side, we have Thomas Jefferson, author of the Declaration, James Madison, father of the Constitution, and they're going to be more supportive of a strict constitution and also not having a national bank, but also having stronger state rights. Where on the Federalist side, they believe in a stronger federal government, being able to create that national bank and having a little bit more flexibility when it comes to what the Constitution allows the government to do. So, what does this look like overall? Hamilton versus Jefferson, they argue, what is the extent of what's the power of the federal government? Should the government be able to do whatever it wants, or should it have to do only what the Constitution says that it can do? For Federalists, they believe that the national bank was constitutional. Hamilton uses the phrase necessary and proper from the Constitution and argued that the bank would be for the general welfare. On the Democratic Republican side, Jefferson argues that it's not constitutional, that the national bank is not explicitly defined as a power of the federal government in the Constitution, and that banks should be controlled at the state level. So overall, we have this division of these 2 groups kind of on their definition of what the Constitution means and also where they favor the power to be. On the Federalist side, it would be at the federal level, and on the Democratic Republican side, it would be more on the state level. So let's move on with our presidents. We're on to Adams now. As president, John Adams was not the most popular, but and his time in office is relatively short. He is only in office for 4 years. He's not reelected to a second term. And while he's in office, he has many things he struggles with. The first being the Alien and Sedition Acts, and lastly, the XYZ affair. But he is ultimately able to avoid war with France. The Alien and Sedition Acts he's criticized for because many people felt like this violated citizens' rights, such as the First Amendment, and also took advantage of legal, I would say, the legal way for people to become citizens, for immigrants to become citizens. Let's read about the Alien and Sedition Acts. Federalists saw this as an opportunity for political advantage over the pro-French Republicans. With patriotism running high, they increased the size of the army and navy and began to capture armed French merchant ships at sea. They then went even further and passed the Alien and Sedition Acts in 1798. The Alien Act extended the time before a person could become a citizen from 5 to 14 years. The reason behind this was that immigrants were all joining the Republican Party. The law also gave the president power to deport undesirable aliens. This Alien Act stays in place, but the Sedition Act is eventually repealed. We have the states of Virginia and Kentucky arguing that these that the Sedition Act essentially violated the First Amendment. A number of other critics were heard as well. The Virginia and Kentucky legislatures passed resolutions protesting the law, and eventually it is repealed. Moving on to Jefferson, we have Thomas Jefferson coming into office. He's elected in the Revolution of 1800. This was a peaceful transition of power from the Federalists. In 1803, he approves the Louisiana Purchase, and this doubled the size of the nation and gave America control of the Mississippi River. So this was a huge land purchase. It is doubles the size of the U.S., and it was relatively cheap, about $15 million. Essentially, Jefferson sent envoys just to find out if the United States could access the Mississippi River in New Orleans as a city, and Napoleon and the French offered to sell him the entire caboodle for a pretty good price. He also sends out Lewis and Clark on their expedition to find out more about this new territory. He's kind of uncertain whether the Constitution allowed the federal government to buy new territory, but he went ahead with the purchase. He made it a treaty with France, and so that was one of his executive powers. In 1804, he sends out Meriwether Lewis and William Clark to explore this new region to find out more information about it. And their expedition is going to lay the groundwork for the future westward expansion of the United States. We see them documenting new plants and animals, and also mapping terrain for future explorers. He also passes the Embargo Act, and this is a part of his foreign policy. This is one of the more controversial actions that Jefferson takes as president. War had continued to rage between Britain and France, and British ships had started stopping U.S. ships to search for deserters from the British Navy. Sometimes they took Americans to serve on these British ships, and this practice of impressment, or what we refer to as impressment, is forced military service, is going to make the Americans very angry. Essentially, like their people are being kidnapped by a foreign country, and puts a lot of pressure on Jefferson to take action here. Jefferson does try to avoid war with the Embargo Act. He pushes this act through Congress, and under the law, American ships are then prohibited from trading with European nations. Unfortunately, the Embargo Act has a really bad effect on the U.S. economy. We see trade dip to its lowest point. The economy is struggling, and eventually Congress does repeal the Embargo Act and replace it with a different law that only limited goods from Britain or France. That's kind of the end of Jefferson, the most of what we need to know about him. Just as a recap here, we have the Louisiana Purchase. The U.S. wanted better access to New Orleans and Mississippi River, and we can see the Louisiana Purchase here in green. And this does double the size of the United States. So we go from just having the orange and blue here to being doubled in size with this green section. We still have the British up here in the Oregon Territory and the Spanish in this section of the southwestern United States. But for the most part, the continent's coming together. His second act was the Embargo Act, and this was really done to try to stop the impressment of U.S. sailors. It cuts off imports and exports with France and Britain and hurts their economies, and also mainly hurts the U.S. economy. It does postpone war with Britain, but has bad effects on the U.S. economy and also leads to smuggling. On to Madison. We have James Madison, who's elected after Jefferson. They're of the same political party. Madison had been the father of the Constitution. We have his fellow Democratic Republican James Madison, became the nation's fourth president in 1809. Americans are going to be drawn into another war with Great Britain under Madison's time in office. This is known as the War of 1812, or the Second War for Independence. This war had some different causes than what we're used to seeing for wars. The first being that the British ships had continued to stop American ships and seizing or impressing U.S. sailors. So we can see that here up the top, impressment of U.S. citizens. The other was the interference in U.S. shipping. And then lastly, British support of Native American resistance. And this was around the Great Lakes region in that Northwest Territory below the Canadian border. At the same time, some young congressmen thought that it was a good time potentially to take Canada from the British and make Canada a part of the U.S. territory. And in 1812, Madison asked Congress to declare war on Britain. Some major events that you need to know from this are going to be the Battle of New Orleans, where Andrew Jackson becomes a national hero. We have Francis Scott Key on a ship at the Battle of Fort McHenry, and he writes the lyrics to the Star Spangled Banner, which becomes the national anthem. The big impacts here of the war are what we mainly focus on for the War of 1812. And besides having increased American patriotism or nationalism because of this victory, there's weakened Native American resistance. So from this point forward, Native Americans will have very little ability to take on the U.S. government as an equal enemy. And lastly, here, the big one, U.S. manufacturing grew. If we look here on our outcomes of the war, we see the expansion of manufacturing. This is going to have a huge impact on the U.S. economy. First off, Europeans are going to realize that they can't interfere with American trade. We have the Great Lakes no longer disputed after this war is over. It becomes the shared property of Canada and the United States. But mainly the War of 1812 is going to spur the economic growth of the United States. So we're going to see a huge increase in industrial growth, in manufacturing. This mostly is due to the British blockade that had created a shortage of cotton cloth in the United States during the war. And we have these northeastern factories and manufacturers who are willing to increase production and be able to supply the American market with American-made goods. The government's also going to place tariffs on imported goods, making these American products more competitive. And this leads us into our next unit, which will study the Industrial Revolution. This also takes us into the era of good feelings. This was a period in which all Americans belonged to the same political party, and we'll look at that next. James Monroe is going to be our 5th president. He is the last of the founding fathers' presidents. The next president after this will be John Quincy Adams, who is the son of John Adams. And he's the 2nd generation of presidents, or what we refer to as the 2nd generation. Monroe's going to have 2 very important events during his presidency. The first is what we refer to as the era of good feelings. The era of good feelings was a time period in which, like I mentioned, most Americans were a part of the same political party, the Democratic Republican Party. This was due mostly to the collapse of the Federalist Party, that old party of Alexander Hamilton and John Adams. Unfortunately, the Federalists, who were mostly based around New England, had opposed the War of 1812 because it had cut off trade with Europe, and most of the merchants and the importing and exporting that happened in the country was happening in New England around these merchant areas. We have New England Federalists even passing resolutions during this time period calling for secession or to secede from the Union. And after this war is over, the Federalist Party is going to become very unpopular and eventually dissolves. They don't have a candidate to run against Monroe in his for a second term, and so he actually runs and wins the presidency unopposed. The era of good feelings, though, under Monroe is really known as a time of American nationalism. So we have this increase in pride in the nation that surges after the victory of the War of 1812, mainly essentially because Americans had preserved their independence from Great Britain, had learned to cooperate in this common effort to take on the enemy. The other thing that Monroe is well known for is the Adams-Onis Treaty, in which his Secretary of State, John Quincy Adams, is going to negotiate for the purchase of Florida. And we also have the Missouri Compromise, which we'll look at more in depth during westward expansion, that allows for the new state of Missouri to come in as a slave state and for the state of Maine to be created as a free state. Monroe's foreign policy is known as the Monroe Doctrine. It's easy enough. He had fought in the American Revolution and helped negotiate the Louisiana Purchase. He served as Secretary of State under President Madison. And in 1817, Monroe becomes president, and he gives his own message to Congress in which he issues a bold foreign policy statement. He repeated the nation's long-standing commitment to neutrality. So he went back to Washington's neutrality again and offered a warning to Europe. The American and French revolutions had inspired people in Latin America to be free, and during the Napoleonic Wars, Spain had been cut off from its colonies. The Spanish colonists grew accustomed to self-government, similar to how the American colonists had. Um, and when Spain's king was restored, he tried to reassert control of the colonies in South America. Colonists in Latin America then declared their independence, and later it was feared that France would help Spain reconquer the colonies. Monroe decided to make a big announcement to Europe in this situation. He announced the United States would oppose any attempts by European powers to establish new colonies or to restore Spanish rule in countries in the Western Hemisphere that achieved their independence. So essentially, he's coming out saying that European nations cannot and should not come back to the Western Hemisphere to reclaim their colonies. We can see that here with the Monroe Doctrine with our cartoon. Monroe standing there with the stop sign says, essentially telling Europeans, by order of the Monroe Doctrine, you must stop. You can't come back over to this side of the world. He says in the Monroe Doctrine, our policy in regard to Europe is not to interfere in the internal concerns of its powers, but to cultivate friendly relations with it and to preserve the just claims of every power, submitting to injuries from none. But this continent's circumstances are different. It is impossible that the European powers should extend their political system to any portion of this continent without endangering our peace and happiness. It is impossible that we should hold such involvement with indifference. It is still the true policy of the United States to leave the parties to themselves in the hope that other powers will pursue the same course. So essentially, he's saying we will have peace and we will not go to war, and you need to stay on your side of the world and leave these newly independent colonies alone. The Monroe Doctrine essentially told Europeans to keep their hands off the Western Hemisphere. Besides warning Spain and France, Monroe is also addressing Russia, whose advance down the Alaskan coastline threatened U.S. claims to the Oregon Territory in the West. In this way, the United States established its own sphere of influence in North America. So going back to the era of good feelings once again, looking at this era, we see some major characteristics here. The political characteristics was included that there was just one political party, the Democratic Republicans, which were soon becoming known as just the Republicans. The Federalist Party is going to dissolve after opposing the War of 1812, and there's not a lot of political differences among the American people. Some economic characteristics we talked about, spurring economic growth after the War of 1812, and that we see that here as well with industrial growth and commerce. We have more manufacturing in the northern states, and we still have plantation system and agriculture in the South. The social characteristics of this time period, this era of history, we have Francis Scott Key's Star Spangled Banner, which becomes the national anthem, and we have increased nationalism. Also, we had looked at the Hudson River School art, which celebrated American themes of nationalism and nature and property. The era of good feelings came to an end with the presidential election of 1824, and we'll learn about this election later on in the chapter. So, key events in the era of good feelings, we have the end of party conflict, surge of American nationalism. We have the Monroe Doctrine that comes out. There's some big events that happened during this time period. As we go through our slides and review this information, take a minute to go back and recall our 5 presidents once again and their major contributions. So looking at this chart here for Washington, you should be able to recall the Proclamation of Neutrality for his foreign policy, his farewell address, the Whiskey Rebellion, and Hamilton's economic plan. For Adams, we would have the Alien and Sedition Acts and the XYZ affair and avoiding war with France. He also built up the military during this time. Jefferson, when he comes into office, he deals with first the Louisiana Purchase, 1803, and he doubles the size of the United States, while also sending Lewis and Clark out to explore this area and send back information to help with westward expansion. And he also has the Embargo Act for his foreign policy to try to avoid war with Britain and France, but in effect ends up hurting the U.S. economy instead. Moving into Mr. Madison's War, we have the War of 1812 under James Madison. A lot of historians have argued this was an unavoidable conflict after Washington, Adams, and Jefferson had worked for years to try to prevent a war from occurring. Madison and the Democratic Republicans in Congress are able to start that war with Great Britain for a couple of different reasons, but the big outcome here is going to be increased industrial growth and economic growth following the War of 1812, mostly because of a shortage of British goods during this time period. And lastly, we have James Monroe. His domestic policy is less policy and more of a time period, which we described as the era of good feelings. And his foreign policy is probably the better known of the presidents, and his is the Monroe Doctrine, which closed the Western Hemisphere to any further European colonization. So that's the end cap of our Unit 5, the Early Republic Review. If you need to go back and watch the video again, feel free. Be sure that you've answered your questions throughout, and we will see you in the next one.